I want to invite you to join us as we read from the book of 1 Corinthians this morning. Today's passage is 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 through 27. I'll read the passage and then finish by saying, "This is the word of the Lord," and you can respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." So 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 27 says this. "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive perishable wealth, but we imperishable. They do it to receive an perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, it's a joy to be here with you, and what a joy to hear from Phil and Heather as they're getting ready to go out to France. How amazing is it that we as Christians can pray and can give and can partner with people all around the world as we see the gospel expand not just here in our city, but in places like France. So we are so excited. It's a real gift to have you with us and to be able to support and pray for you on your mission. And we're excited to be with you at the ground level to start and to see where this is going to go in the next couple of decades. It was also a joy for me to be with you last weekend. It was so exciting in so many ways. I know I heard that you were all blessed by the testimonies that we heard of salvation, the baptisms. In fact, I had many conversations where people said, "Man, those testimonies were amazing. They were amazing. Oh, the sermon was good. It was okay. It was good. But the testimonies, So I love hearing that. That's amazing. It was great to see so many of you stepping out in faith and inviting somebody to come and to be part of our family, to let people know that what we do here at GCC is not just for us, right? It's for everyone who would want to hear this message and believe in Jesus. And so there were so many things to enjoy and to celebrate about last week. And as I was thinking, after the fact about Easter, there's a question that I was thinking about, and it's one that keeps coming to mind over the years as we've started this church. And the question for me is, how far will we go to make sure that Santa Cruz hears the good news of Jesus? How far will we go to make sure that our city hears the good news of Jesus? How far will we go to make sure that cities beyond us hear the good news? What will we do to send out missionaries and pastors and church planters all over the world? And I wonder sometimes, as we've started, and God is doing an amazing work here, we are the messengers, right, that God has placed in this area. We have a message of eternal significance. We have a good news. We have a gospel message, the news that the King has come and he's rescuing his world and he's calling people into relationship with him. This is the message we carry. And as we've started well as a church, I wonder if there's going to come a point where we will become complacent in sharing the good news, where we'll start to think that all of this is simply for us and for our own comfort and our own edification. This passage from 1 Corinthians should light a fire inside of us to see the gospel go out, not just to those that we know and to our families and friends, but to the nations and to the world. It should light a fire for us to see people know the God who created them. It's an amazing passage, and if you're new with us, we're in the book of 1 Corinthians. So just some quick overview of this book. This book is written by the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul was an early believer in Jesus who was given a special mission, right? As an apostle, he had a special task, and he was a missionary going out and planting these churches in places where no one had ever heard of Jesus. He was breaking new ground, starting these churches, and one of the places that he started the church was in this Greek city of Corinth. And now he's writing a letter a few years after he started this church to instruct this young church and to correct certain errors in how they're operating. And so Paul loves these people, and he is very concerned about how they live and follow Jesus. The section we're in right now in 1 Corinthians, we've titled this Wisdom in the Church. Starting in chapter 8, it's all about how do we operate in situations that are difficult, that are challenging? How do we have wisdom to live rightly as Christians? And a couple weeks ago when we started chapter 9, we saw the first half or 2/3 of this chapter. Paul is focusing on his own rights as a Christian, as an apostle, as a leader in the church. He's doing this because previously he had addressed certain issues with the Corinthians' view of their rights. They were very focused on what they had the right to do in the church, and they were doing those things even to the harm of other people in the church. And so Paul puts himself forward as an example, and he says, I have the right to get paid for the ministry that I do. You should be supporting me. And he says, but I'm going to forego that right. I'm going to give that up. I'm going to lay down my preferences and my comfort, and I'm going to do that in order to serve others for the gospel. And so Paul puts himself forward. He's saying, I'm not going to cash that check because that's how much I want people to know the gospel, even in unreached places. And that's why it's very common for us in a frontier kind of mission to support people in that mission. Right? If we're going to a difficult place like France where there's not many churches, we don't want people to be dependent on the mission field to give them support, because it could kind of muddy the waters and compromise the message of the gospel. So instead, we support them and send them out in strength so that they can give freely to those they're ministering to. And so we see that Paul is so focused on this message of the gospel that everything else is focused on that. And this word gospel, we've seen this is so important in the book of 1 Corinthians. It's so important in the entire Bible. That word gospel is obviously, it's in our name as a church. It's the word in Greek, euangelion. And what it means is, it means very simply, good news. Good news. The gospel message that Paul is so focused on, that he wants to give and put everything second to, that message is the news of God's eternal victory in the world. The news that God has sent his son Jesus to live among us, right, as a human, to enter into our reality, to live a sinless life, and then to lay down his life as a sacrifice for us. And then as we celebrated last week, we know he didn't stay dead, but he was raised to life, to a new power of life. And through his death and resurrection, he saves sinners like us, and he makes us into a new creation. And he promises one day to return again and to redeem all things, starting with us, his people. And so he's calling us now to enter into his salvation. He's given us a message, this message of the good news, which changes reality forever. So if you're new to this church, if you're new to Christianity, I want you to know that you're not going to hear week by week from this pulpit, you're not going to hear simply good advice, as helpful as that might be. You're going to hear good news of an event that has happened that changes everything. And it's only by believing in this message, by knowing this King, and by receiving forgiveness in his name, that you can have any hope for the future, that you can have any hope for eternity. So Paul here is showing that he's doing everything for the sake of the gospel. That's the theme of this section. He's doing everything for the sake of the gospel. And we see essentially two ways that he gives everything for the gospel. Okay, so two ways that he commits himself to the gospel message. The first thing we see is that Paul gives up everything for the sake of the gospel. Paul gives up everything for the sake of the gospel. And we're going to see this in verses 19 to 22, or 23, I'm sorry. Give up everything for the sake of the gospel. So Paul goes on in more detail in this passage to explain why he's going without pay, why he's giving up his rights for the sake of others. Look at verse 19. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." So Paul understands here in this verse, he understands that he is free, that there's no one who can put an obligation on him. Paul is free to operate how he wants, and yet Paul, in his freedom, takes the posture of a slave. When he says here that he's made himself a servant, the language is literally, he's saying, I have enslaved myself. That word servant is too weak of a word for what Paul is actually saying here. He's saying, even though I'm free, I've made myself a slave to everyone. In other words, Paul sees his freedom as being an opportunity to give up his freedom for the sake of others. He's saying, I'm going to be a slave. I'm going to go to the lowest levels to serve other people, to do the things that no one else wants to do. And he gives 4 categories of people that he serves. 4 different categories of people that he serves here. Let's go through these. First, he says he serves the Jews. Look at verse 20. He says, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. Now, this is very strange language from Paul for him to say, I became a Jew to the Jews. And the reason it's very strange is because Paul is a Jew. He's Jewish, right? So it'd be like me saying, I became, a tall person to tall people. That's who I am. I'm 6'5". I'm very tall. I became an American to win the Americans. No, I am. I'm born in America. That's who I am. But I think this is very instructive. Okay, so part of this, of what Paul's saying, is almost certainly speaking to the Jewish religion, right? So Jew is one of those unique ethnicities that's also a religion. So it's both and. But he's going to say in the next phrase that he's going to become, one under the law to those under the law. So that is speaking more to the law aspect. This seems to be speaking not entirely to the religious aspect, but also to the ethnicity aspect. I think this has to do with him saying, at least in part, that he becomes ethnically Jewish to those who are ethnically Jewish. Which means, in other words, that Paul, who was born a Jew, raised a Jew, was, in his own language in Philippians 3, essentially, paraphrasing, he was the king of the Jews, kind of, right? He's like the most Jewish Jew guy ever. Even though Paul was raised in that culture, Paul does not see his ethnic background as being essential to his identity. He sees his walk with Christ as being much more foundational to who he is. And so he says, oh yeah, I'll become a Jew for the Jews, but that's not the most fundamental thing about me. And I think this is instructive, especially for where our world is today. We have to be careful in our culture of those who focus so heavily and so consistently on ethnicity over against everything else, and who want to divide people into all these subcategories and then make them war against each other as if we're not all part of the same human race. We have to be careful of those who think that people with different skin colors should act and think a certain way and can fit into certain categories because of the way they look. This kind of thinking, we've seen it throughout history, and it always ends with disastrous consequences. It always ends that way. And yet we're falling back into that thinking today. We're segregating people again. We're dividing people based on the way they look. And this time, we're doing it with great motives. It's with good motives, right? Because every other time in history, it wasn't with quote-unquote good motives. No, it's ridiculous. It's evil. And of course, we have to call it what it is. We have to be careful not to think in these ways. Paul here is saying that he's, in some sense, indirectly, he's saying that his ethnicity or the color of his skin, or whatever we would put a label on it, is not that important to who he is. And we should think in the same way. But I'm getting off track here. Let's get back on track here. So the first group he serves are the Jews. Second, he says he serves those who are under the law. He serves those who are under the law. Verse 20, the second part there, he says, to those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. So when he speaks of the law here, what he's speaking of is what's known as the Old Covenant in Scripture, or the Mosaic Law. That's what he's speaking of here. So if you're not familiar with how the Bible works, the Bible is divided in 2 sections, right? Old Testament and New Testament. The dividing line is the coming of Jesus. So the New Testament starts with the coming of Jesus. Before Jesus comes and gives himself as a sacrifice, there was a whole system in place, a whole system of sacrifices and laws and rituals that Jews had to observe, that true followers of God had to observe. This was called the Old Covenant. And the Old Covenant is instituted very early in the Bible through Moses, who's the prophet, and it's known as the Mosaic Law because Moses is the one who receives this law from God on Mount Sinai. And this covenant did a few different things. It did a few really important things. This covenant, first of all, expressed God's eternal will, his eternal moral commands. It expressed those in a clear way, the commands that God had given at the creation of the world. So that's one thing. It takes that moral law that's consistent with God for all of time, and it expresses them for God's people. The second thing it does is it forms Israel as a nation and gives them a set of laws to operate as a political entity, right, as a nation. And the third thing it does is it starts the Levitical priesthood and shows how worship is done at the temple and at the tabernacle. So three different aspects. So this is one way we can understand the different elements of law that are given in this covenant. There's the moral law, as we said, that's the eternal will of God. That's what he expresses from creation, and it's unchanging. It's based on his character. There's the civic law, which is how the nation of Israel is supposed to operate. There are laws specific to a certain nation at a certain time. And then there's the ceremonial law, which shows people how to worship God in the temple and how to live in a way that is in line with that worship. So when Jesus comes, he fulfills that old covenant. He fulfills it, and he puts in place the new covenant, which supersedes the old covenant. So the law, in a sense, is no longer in effect. Right? The civic law, the laws that were specific to a nation state, no longer apply to us. Just like the laws of a different country wouldn't apply to us as American citizens. That law for us is done because God's people are no longer a certain nation. They transcend those national boundaries. The ceremonial law also doesn't apply anymore because the temple and all the imagery involved with it is all fulfilled. There's no more sacrifices to be made because Jesus Christ was sacrificed once and for all. And so all of those systems, all those rituals, all that cult is done away with. But the moral law, of course, continues because that's been in effect since the foundation of the world. So we still can't murder people, we still can't lie, we still can't steal. These are all things that have always been true from the very beginning. So Paul says, I'm not under that old covenant. I'm not under that old law anymore. But I will follow those rituals. I will act like one under the law in order to teach and to witness to and to share the gospel with people who are under the law. In other words, Paul's saying, if I can do something just to, not offend or to kind of get along in order to share the gospel, I'm fine with doing that. If it inconveniences me, then I'll do it. The way that Paul interacts with the law is, it's very confusing sometimes if you read the Bible, because at times he'll make these definitive statements of, things like circumcision, don't be circumcised. It's no longer in effect, right? And if you circumcise, if you trust in circumcision, you forfeit the whole gospel. And other times we'll see him doing strange things. So for example, in the book of Galatians, we see that Paul had a protege named Titus. And in Galatians 2, Paul refuses to circumcise Titus. Now circumcision was the kind of the penultimate or the ultimate sign of the covenant, right? When you were born as a Jew, if you're a boy, you were circumcised to show you were in the covenant people. And after Jesus comes, Paul says, I'm not going to circumcise Titus. I'm not going to do it. And it causes a big stir. It causes a lot of controversy. Then in Acts chapter 15, there's something called the Jerusalem Council. So that the leaders of the church get together and they try to figure out, how do we follow the law, or should we follow the law? Should we circumcise? And the council decides, no. Christ has fulfilled the law. We don't have to circumcise people anymore. And so Paul, he wins the day, right? He gets his way. He shows that you don't have to follow the law, the Old Testament law, to be a follower of Jesus. And then, immediately after the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 16, Paul takes another protege of his named Timothy and circumcises him. This is very confusing, right? Why would Paul be so stalwart and so against circumcising Titus, saying, no, The gospel says he does not have to do this. And then once a decision is made and it's clarified, he says, oh yeah, I'll circumcise my next protege. Well, Paul, I think what he's doing is Paul understands that there's a time to be firm and unmoving, and that time is when there's any confusion about what the gospel is. See, before there was a decision, Paul knew that if he were to do this, people would think that you have to do some sort of outward law-keeping in order to be a follower of Jesus. But once the decision is made, Paul says, now that we all know that's not tied to salvation in Jesus, I will do it simply to open a door to the gospel with these people. See, Paul understood when to be firm and when to be accommodating and loving and to make exceptions for other people. So Paul says, I will be as one under the law in order to serve those under the law. Third, it says he serves those without the law. Look at verse 21. He says, to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. So those outside the law that he's speaking of here are those Gentiles who don't follow the Mosaic law. And he's saying to those outside the law, I will accommodate myself and I will do certain things in order to reach them. Now, what he's not saying here is where so many Christians have gone wrong. He's not saying that I will sin in order to bring people to Jesus. He's not the youth pastor who's like, yeah, I'll smoke weed with the pothead kids so I have an open door to share the gospel, which I wish was totally a made-up story. There are just some crazy people out there. Not from personal experience. No, he's saying I will live and associate with those who certain groups, the Jewish people, might think are unclean or unworthy of the good news. I will go to them and I will enter into their world to share the gospel with them. It's interesting that Paul speaks of himself in verse 20 as not being myself under the law, but then in verse 21 he says, I'm not outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. You can see how complicated it can be to understand the relationship of the Christian to the law with this kind of language. So he's not under the law, but he is, he's under the law of Christ. It sounds like he's contradicting himself almost, but what does he mean? He's not under the old covenant, but he's under this, what he calls the law of Christ. What is the law of Christ? Well, I think, to put it in the simplest terms, it refers to what we follow as Christians, which are those eternal moral principles of God. The eternal principles expressed in the Ten Commandments. The eternal principles, I would argue, expressed in the way God creates the world. Those things are unchanging, and they apply even to the Christian. And we can also gain eternal principles even from the ceremonial and the civic law in the Old Testament. We saw this in the last passage in Corinthians, actually, when he says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. And we said that old, archaic law, he took an eternal principle out of that. And he says it matters how you treat the people that are employed for you. It matters how you treat other people. So we can gain eternal principles from all of God's commands. And so the law of Christ are those basic eternal principles of God's moral law. And they include this basic central principle of self-sacrificial love for others. In Galatians 5:14, Paul says, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's the whole law. Love your neighbor as yourself. Galatians 6:2, it says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So the basic principle is one of love for neighbor and sacrifice for others. And if you want to know how to do that in every given moment, you look at the eternal law of God. In other words, the law of Christ puts it in the simplest terms is love others sacrificially. The law of Christ is to love like Christ loved us, giving up everything to enter into our reality, to lay it all down for us, to give us the greatest gift, his own life. So Paul serves those outside the law. And then fourth, he serves those who are weak. Verse 22 says, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. When he brings up this word, the weak, this is a key term in 1 Corinthians. It's one he's used a number of times starting back in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27. If you want to turn back there, you can see this. 1 Corinthians 1:27, Paul says, "But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." So he points out here that God identifies with and loves those who are weak in the world, those who are seen as the lowly and the despised in the world. And Paul himself identifies with them. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 10, that he himself is weak. So these weak people, this is a key term. And we saw in chapter 8 that there was this division in the church because there were certain people who were weak, the same word used here. They were weak in the faith. And those who were stronger, or who had this sort of knowledge, were doing things that hurt and affected those who were weak in the faith. And Paul says, no, we should lay down our rights for those who are weak. And so Paul's bringing the argument full circle, and he's saying, I'll become the one who is weak for the sake of the gospel. If I can just win some people to the gospel, then I'll become weak if that's what it takes. And think about it. What did Jesus Christ do for those who were weak? Romans 5:6 tells us this, for while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. God looks at us who are weak people, at least we were at one point, and Jesus Christ in compassion and in love lays down his life for us. So Paul's simply doing what Jesus Christ himself does. So we see these four different groups that Paul serves, and really they encapsulate every person in the world. Paul's saying, I will serve anybody if I can bring them the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then he gives two reasons why we should serve for the sake of the gospel. Two very simple reasons. First reason is to save souls. He keeps saying over and over in this passage, to win them, or to win more, or to win someone, right? Again and again he's using this word win. And what he means by that is he wants to win someone over. Not win an argument, but win someone over to the gospel of Jesus. He's trying to win over a person. In verse 22, the second half of verse 22, he says, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. All things to all people, that by all means I might save some. There's no more comprehensive or definitive statement that Paul is saying, I will do anything for the sake of the gospel. I will give up everything for the sake of the gospel. Paul's hope is that he might save some. That people might be saved. That there is a disaster that is coming for those who don't know Jesus. That there is an end to this life that ends in horror for those who don't know Jesus. And that horror is one of being separated from the goodness and the grace of God forever. We can't even conceive of how terrible that would be, to be away from the goodness and the grace and the blessing of the one who created us. And Paul is saying, I want people to be saved from that. I want them to be saved from the wrath of God, from the punishment they deserve. I want them to be saved so they can know God. Do you see your God-given role of saving souls? Do you see that God has given to you a message to certain people in a certain time, in a certain place, that no one else can bring to them? Are you sharing this good news, or are you just keeping that news to yourself? If you're keeping the good news of Jesus to yourself, then one of two things has to be true. Either you don't know the message that you think you know, or you don't love the people that you think you love. Let me say it again. If you're keeping the message to yourself, either you don't know the message you think you know, or you don't love the people you think you love. Because if you knew this message, a free gift to anyone who will receive it. And if you love the people around you, people that are in desperate need of God's love and grace, they don't have the truth of the gospel, people that are headed toward hell without that message, if you saw that clearly, then you would tell them. You would tell them. You would pray desperately day by day that God would give you an opportunity to share this good news with them, that they'd receive it and be transformed. And when the time comes, you'll be bold to step out in faith and to share with them. So Paul says, I do this so that people can be saved, but also he says he does this to be blessed. Paul's obsessed with the gospel message because it brings blessing to him. Look at verse 23. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. Paul wants to share in the blessings of the gospel with the people he's sharing this good news. There's a lot of discussions among scholars about what those blessings entail. What does Paul mean by these blessings? Some people think he's just talking about salvation itself, that is the blessing that comes from the gospel. Some think he's talking about some sort of reward in addition to salvation. Regardless of what he means, what he clearly is saying is that you should seek to save souls for eternity because it is an incredible, immeasurable blessing. Because it is the greatest blessing that we can have in this life. Do you see the blessing that you have to bring this good news to others? Or do you view it as a burden, something to be avoided? Man, why do I do what I do as a pastor? There's a lot of reasons, right? I think it's the right thing. I feel like I've been called to it. But one of the biggest reasons I do what I do as a pastor is because I love doing it. It gives me so much joy. It's such an amazing thing for me to have this gift from God to speak to some of you who I've known for a decade plus and some of you who I've never met. Yet I get to look into your eyes to share this amazing truth that not only does the God of the universe know you and care about you and love you, but that he's done something about it in history. He's given his son Jesus to redeem people like you. Do you know the blessing that it is to share the good news of Jesus? I think it's easy to say, well, I'm never going to speak to 200 people in a room. Maybe that's true. But you get a much more important job, which is to walk with people over the long term, to speak face to face, to deal with issues as they come up, to present and apply the gospel to people's lives. You have an incredible blessing if you will step out in faith and share the good news with those that God's placed in your life. Maybe you serve in the kids ministry here at church. Don't ever get to a place where you think that's a burden, where you want to avoid that. You get to shape these little souls for eternity. If you're in youth ministry or you work in college ministry, you get to work with people at an age or to witness people at an age where they are making decisions. They're making there's a fork in the road, and they may turn in one direction and be going that direction for the rest of their lives and on into eternity. And you get to capture them at that age of opportunity and point them toward Jesus. Or if you have friends in your life that don't know Jesus, and every conversation matters, everything that you do matters. They're watching you whether you know it or not. Or in your families with your little ones. You as a parent have the most profound impact on your kid of anyone for eternity. Or even with your parents or your siblings, right? I've seen so many children lead their parents to faith in Jesus. It happens all the time. Don't stop praying. Don't stop sharing the good news. Don't stop encouraging them to believe in Jesus. Maybe you're asking with all of this, well, how can I share the gospel with people? This seems like such a difficult thing. Well, I just want to give you a couple of very basic things. And really what I want to say is that you should share what you know with the people in your life right now and do it sacrificially. That's it. Share what you know. If you've been a Christian for a day, then you know something about Jesus. It may be very basic. You may just know he changed my life, he's the Son of God, something basic like that. But you can share that joy and that little bit of a message with those around you. And if they say to you that dreaded question, right, what about some big philosophical question, right? How can there be evil if God's real, whatever? To just say to them, I don't know. We should look into that together. Or you can just say, Brandon will answer all of your questions. No, no, I'm always open to answering questions, but share what you know. Just start there and share what you know with the people that are already in your life. Every one of us has people that we are in contact with every single day or every single year that don't know the good news of Jesus. Start with those people. Love on them. Care about them. Pray for them. And take just 20 seconds of courage to jump in and have a conversation with them, to ask a challenging question. You can do that and share with them sacrificially. Get out of your comfort zone. That's one of the greatest sacrifices we can make very often, is to do something that's uncomfortable, like invite someone to church or bring up eternal things, eternal questions. Give up your preferences for them. Pray for them daily and persevere with them. Don't just throw someone the gospel and if they don't accept it right away, walk away. Walk with them over the long term. If God's placed them in your life, persevere with them. Keep sharing with them. Keep loving them. As free people, we should aim for the greatest good. And the greatest good that we have is salvation through Jesus Christ. So Paul shows us first that we should give up everything for the sake of the gospel. And then second, we see, and we don't have much time for this, but the second thing we see is discipline yourself always for the sake of the gospel. So first, serve sacrificially, right? Give up everything for the sake of the gospel. But second, discipline yourself always for the sake of the gospel. So in the latter part of this passage, Paul brings up this metaphor of athletics. Now, this was something that if you lived in Corinth at that time, you were familiar with, because they had something in Corinth that was a every other year event called the Isthmian Games. Hard to say if you have a lisp, but this was second only to the Olympics as far as athletic events. So the Isthmian Games were this competition, a series of competitions that would consist of all the classic track and field events. There would be the races, discus, javelin, long jump. There would be events like wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and there would even be events for poetry reading and singing for all the nerds out there. So, in fact, funny story, just a little over a decade after Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians, Emperor Nero, the famous emperor, competed in the Isthmian Games, and he competed in the singing competition. And he was famously very bad at singing, very talentless singer. But he sung for hours on end and would not let people leave the arena. They actually barred the gates. It was so bad, according to Suetonius, the famous historian, people started jumping off the wall to get out of the arena. And people even pretended to be dead so that they would be carried out of the arena. And Nero won. Against all odds, he won because he threatened his competitors with death and he bribed the judges. Kind of a funny thing, but Paul here is saying, compete in a way, be careful, be focused, follow the rules so that you can win. And so that you can win something that endures beyond this life. Look at verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. He's saying the Christian life is a race. Sometimes we act as if the Christian life is a stroll along Westcliff, kind of meandering, taking in the sights, being aimless. But that's not the kind of metaphor the Bible gives for the Christian life. In fact, Ben spoke on this topic just a few weeks back from Hebrews chapter 12, right? And the passage says, therefore, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus. So the author of this book, we don't know who that is, but he's saying, run this race. Put everything else aside and run and stay focused on Jesus. Endure, work hard. Paul later in his life, Philippians chapter 3, he says, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Paul understood life is a race. The Christian life is a race, and a race requires focus and it requires effort. And Paul is encouraging us here to stay focused on what matters and to strive and to work hard to share the gospel with others and to stay disciplined and committed to God. You're in a race, Paul says, so run to win the prize. He's not saying here that the prize in the sense of there's certain Christians who lose and certain Christians who win. No, he's using this metaphor simply to say you should be focusing and striving toward what matters the most. 1 Timothy 4:7 says, train yourself for godliness. Discipline yourself. Stay focused. Verse 25, he says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. In these Isthmian Games held near Corinth, they would compete to win a wreath or a crown. And the victor in each sport would receive this wreath, this crown, and it was usually made of something perishable. It was celery originally, which is kind of weird, and then it became pine leaves later. But winning that accolade meant everything for these competitors. This was the highest achievement they could receive, the highest praise they could receive. At Olympia, where the original Olympics were held, there's a monument to a boxer. And it says this. It says, "Here he died, boxing in the stadium, having prayed to Zeus for a wreath or death." This boxer said, I want to win, I want to receive that wreath, that crown, or I want to die. And he died, unfortunately. Rough ending. But the discipline, right, the focus for a crown that would fade away, that would wilt, that would decay. Paul says here, we're disciplining ourselves for a crown that lasts forever. This is not just for momentary praise. This is not just for some trophy to put on a shelf. This is for something that will never, ever perish. And the crown for us as Christians is the crown of eternal life. In fact, Paul at the end of his life says this in 2 Timothy 4:7. He says, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Paul knew the crown was coming, and it was there for everyone who longed for and loved the return of Jesus. Are you striving for that crown? Is your life focused on the eternity that is quickly approaching? Look at how Paul ends this passage in verse 26. He says, "So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Paul's saying, I'm not exerting energy just for the sake of it. I'm not engaged in some futile competition. I'm focused. I'm not just running wherever life takes me. I'm not just shadow boxing. I'm focused on what matters the most, and I'm disciplining myself. The Christian life should be lived with intention, with clarity of what our goal is. And Paul understood it's possible to be teaching other people the good news of Jesus, to be teaching people about how they should live, and for you yourself to never fully believe it. So Paul says, I keep myself disciplined so that the gospel can go out above everything else. You know, I saw after our Easter service, I saw some different news stories of different Easter events around the country. And I saw one that, it made me rethink everything. It was a church that had this full-on production with choreographed dances, hip-hop songs, flames shooting up on stage. There were people dressed as demons dancing around. There was Jesus being crucified, and it was a woman that was playing Jesus. It was out there. And it made me think, right, do we need that kind of stuff to reach people with the gospel? Is that what we need? Do we need to make the gospel more entertaining? No, of course not. We don't need twerking demons or gender-fluid Jesuses, right? We don't need those kinds of things. And often people think we do. The strategy has always been the same. It's been we sacrifice, we serve other people, and we tell them the good news of Jesus. Serve others, discipline yourself. This has to be the strategy because this is what Jesus Christ himself did for us. Jesus became the servant to lay down his life for us. He was the one who was in the form of God but didn't hold on to that, but gave up everything and became a servant to die a humiliating death. Jesus was the servant. He was also the great runner who ran well, who kept his eyes fixed on his mission, who never turned aside, never sinned, and who accomplished his purpose. Let us go and do likewise. Let's pray.